The sound of silence, the paradox of healing. There's a strange kind of quiet that follows real healing, not the silence of absence, but the silence of understanding. It's the kind of quiet that settles in after a storm, when the world finally exhales, and for the first time, there's no longer anything left to prove. Why is it that the most healed people often say the least? Maybe because they've learned that talking, explaining, defending, narrating is something we do when we're still trying to convince ourselves. For most of our lives, we use words as armor. We speak to fill the spaces where understanding hasn't yet taken root. We talk to make sense of pain we haven't yet accepted. But healing, true healing, changes that. When the noise inside begins to quiet, so does the need to project it outward. In a world obsessed with expression, where silence is mistaken for emptiness, this kind of quiet becomes almost rebellious. We live in an age where people are expected to constantly announce what they think, how they feel, what they believe. Every moment must be broadcast. Every thought must be shared. Yet the irony is this: the more we broadcast our lives, the less we seem to truly understand them. Those who have truly faced themselves, begin to realize that words often distort more than they reveal. They see that speech is sometimes a distraction, a way to escape the truth rather than to face it. Silence, then, becomes not a void, but a vessel, the space where clarity begins to form. History remembers the quiet ones: Lao Tzu, who vanished into the mountains after writing his truths; Diogenes, who lived in simplicity, speaking only when he must; even the Buddha, whose greatest teaching was not in words, but in stillness. These figures understood that enlightenment is not a performance. It's a dissolution. The ego that once needed to be seen, to be heard, to be validated, begins to fade. What's left behind is not emptiness, but peace. And yet silence unnerves us. We've been taught to equate talking with confidence and silence with uncertainty. We measure intelligence by eloquence and connection by conversation. But what if the deepest form of understanding doesn't need to be said? What if speech is just the echo of what silence already knows? The healed person doesn't withdraw out of arrogance or detachment. They withdraw because the noise of the world no longer matches the rhythm of their mind. They no longer need to shout into the void to feel real. They've found meaning not in speaking, but in being. Maybe healing isn't about finding something new to say, but realizing there was never a need to say anything at all. Because in the end, the truth doesn't demand to be spoken. It simply exists, quietly, patiently, waiting for us to listen. Noise, trauma, and the modern compulsion to speak. If silence is the language of the healed, then noise is often the cry of the wounded. Our world hums with voices trying to be heard. Conversations, debates, confessions, performances. We talk endlessly, but rarely say anything that touches the truth. The modern age has turned expression into survival, and survival into spectacle. Every emotion must be displayed. Every wound must be made visible. Every opinion shouted before it disappears beneath the avalanche of someone else's noise. But why? Why do we feel such a desperate need to speak? To explain? To justify? The answer lies buried in the psychology of pain. When we experience trauma, rejection, shame, loss, humiliation, the mind becomes restless. It wants to make sense of what happened, to rewrite the story, to be seen and understood. Words become a form of control. If we can name our pain, if we can share it, maybe it won't consume us. We talk because silence feels like drowning, as if the moment we stop speaking, we might vanish into the depth of what we've been avoiding. Carl Jung once wrote that neurosis is always a substitute for legitimate suffering. In the same way, our constant talking, our explanations, our performances are substitutes for healing. We speak not to express truth, but to avoid feeling it fully. Think about it. When someone hasn't yet made peace with their past, they replay it over and over in their words. Every conversation becomes a stage for unhealed pain to act itself out. They explain their story to anyone who will listen, not for understanding, but for validation. The more we talk, the more we reinforce the identity of the wounded self. Speech becomes a cage disguised as freedom. And in the age of social media, this dynamic has metastasized. We've built entire digital ecosystems designed to reward the unhealed for their noise. The more outrage, the more attention. The more confession, the more approval. Vulnerability has become currency, an aesthetic, a marketing tool. What was once sacred, the act of sharing one's pain, has been commodified and emptied of meaning. We call it connection, but it's really fragmentation. A collective scream echoing through millions of screens, none of it truly heard. We talk because silence in the digital world is the same as disappearance. To exist, one must be loud. But beneath this culture of noise lies something more ancient, something primal. In early human societies, speech was a survival mechanism. To be heard was to belong, and to belong was to live. Isolation meant danger. Silence could mean death. Our instincts still carry this ancient memory. To be silent feels unsafe, as if quiet means invisibility, and invisibility means erasure. Yet healing reverses this instinct. When a person begins to confront their inner wounds, the need to perform dissolves. They no longer chase belonging through noise because they have found belonging within themselves. They no longer speak to be validated because they've learned that understanding doesn't require an audience. Speech, for the unhealed, is a form of armor. But for the healed, silence becomes a home. This is why the paradox of our time is so striking. We are surrounded by unprecedented access to communication, billions of voices connected at once. And yet, never before have people felt more unseen, more misunderstood. The more we talk, the more we drown each other out. Perhaps the problem isn't that no one is listening. Perhaps the problem is that we've forgotten how to listen to ourselves. When healing begins, we start to hear something subtler beneath the noise, the quiet whisper of truth that doesn't need to be performed. That's why the healed grow quiet, not out of superiority, but out of alignment. They've realized that most of what we call conversation is actually just the avoidance of silence. We talk until we can bear to be quiet. We explain until we no longer need to understand. We shout until the silence no longer terrifies us. The compulsion to speak isn't a flaw, it's a signal. It's the soul's way of saying it hasn't found peace yet. But once healing arrives, real, grounded healing, something extraordinary happens. Words lose their urgency. The story loses its grip. And what remains isn't emptiness, but serenity. In that stillness, speech becomes sacred again. Not constant, not performative, but intentional. The healed speak less, but when they do, their words carry the weight of silence behind them. And maybe that's the truest sign of wisdom in a world addicted to noise, to know when not to speak. The psychology of silence. What happens when we stop explaining ourselves? At some point in the healing process, something subtle but profound begins to shift. You stop needing to be understood. The urge to clarify your intentions, to defend your choices, to prove your worth, it begins to fade. What once felt unbearable, that silent gap between yourself and others, becomes strangely peaceful. This is where true healing takes root. not in speaking more clearly, but in realizing you never had to speak at all. Psychologists have long described healing as a process of integration, the merging of all the fragmented parts of ourselves into a unified whole. Before that integration, our words often come from division, one part of us speaking to justify another, one wound explaining the existence of another. But when those parts begin to align, the internal conflict that fuels speech dissolves. Silence becomes not an absence of communication, but a presence of harmony. We start to realize that much of our need to talk was never about expression. It was about control. To speak was to manage perception, to manipulate how the world saw us. We crafted stories to make our pain palatable, our past logical, our choices acceptable. But when we heal, control no longer feels necessary. The healed person stops explaining not because they've run out of words, but because they've outgrown the need for approval. Viktor Frankl, the psychiatrist who survived the concentration camps, once wrote that those who have a why to live can bear almost any how. What he discovered in silence, in suffering without explanation, was that meaning is not constructed through words, but through endurance. The healed understand this intuitively. Their silence is not a void, but a vessel for meaning that transcends language. There's a point where the self no longer feels compelled to narrate its existence. You begin to notice how much energy is spent explaining yourself to others, to society, even to your own reflection. Every explanation is a small plea for acceptance. Every justification is an unconscious admission that we fear being misunderstood. But silence dismantles that fear. It becomes a declaration of self-trust. I no longer need you to understand me, because I understand myself. This transformation can feel unsettling at first. We've been taught that communication is the foundation of connection. To stop explaining ourselves feels like severing ties with the world. But something beautiful happens in that detachment. A deeper connection forms, not through words, but through presence. People begin to feel you, not because you speak louder, but because your silence carries coherence. You've stopped scattering your energy through explanations. You've gathered it into stillness. Psychologically, this stage represents what some call detachment, not indifference, but liberation from the compulsion to control outcomes. You no longer chase validation because your worth is no longer a debate. You no longer chase understanding because peace doesn't depend on being seen. Silence becomes an act of surrender, a quiet confidence that truth doesn't need defenders. There's a metaphor in Zen philosophy. When a muddy river is left undisturbed, its waters clear on their own. Healing works the same way. As long as we stir the mind with explanations, the water stays clouded. But when we allow silence, when we stop explaining, stop fixing, stop performing, clarity emerges effortlessly. Silence, then, is not the end of communication. It's the beginning of comprehension. It's in that quiet that we finally meet ourselves, stripped of stories, free of justification. The healed person speaks less, but their silence says more. It isn't avoidance, it's mastery. It's the recognition that truth doesn't compete for attention. It simply exists, waiting to be felt. And perhaps that's what healing truly is. Not the ability to talk about your pain without breaking, but the ability to sit in your own stillness without needing to say a word. History's silent thinkers. Wisdom born from withdrawal. Throughout history, silence has been the shadow of wisdom, the quiet echo left behind by those who've seen too much, understood too deeply, or reached beyond what words could ever hold. The great thinkers, mystics, and philosophers of the world often shared one thing in common. After glimpsing truth, they chose silence over persuasion. There's something almost divine about that pattern, as though every step toward enlightenment leads eventually to disappearance. Lao Tzu wrote the Tao Te Ching, a work of barely 5,000 words, and then vanished into the mountains, leaving behind not a legacy of lectures, but of stillness. His final act wasn't to speak more, but to remove himself entirely from the noise of civilization. He understood what few ever do, that words can only point toward truth, never contain it. The Buddha followed a similar path. After his awakening beneath the Bodhi tree, his first impulse was not to teach, but to remain silent. According to tradition, he doubted that anyone could understand what he had realized through words alone. The silence of enlightenment, he knew, could not be translated into language shaped by desire and illusion. It was only later, out of compassion, that he began to speak. But even then, his teachings were full of pauses, metaphors, and deliberate gaps meant to draw the listener into the experience of silence itself. Silence, in these stories, is not retreat. It's transcendence. It's what happens when understanding outgrows language. Consider Diogenes of Sinope, the Greek philosopher who rejected wealth and status to live in a barrel. His silence was not of withdrawal, but of rebellion. He spoke only when words could cut through hypocrisy, and otherwise lived in simplicity so profound that his life itself became philosophy. When asked why he lived as he did, he responded, "Because I prefer to live with reason rather than with opinion." Silence for him was resistance to the noise of conformity. Even in more recent history, silence has remained a refuge for those who see beyond the surface. Friedrich Nietzsche, after years of unraveling the illusions of morality, religion, and culture, descended into his own private silence, a silence that the world mistook for madness. Yet his final years of wordlessness seem almost poetic. After dissecting the limits of meaning, he reached a place where words could no longer follow. Emily Dickinson, too, lived much of her life in seclusion, speaking rarely and publishing almost nothing while alive. Her silence was not shyness, but purity. The belief that truth loses its essence when exposed to an audience too eager to interpret it. Kafka destroyed much of his own work, sensing that some things were meant to remain unspoken. These were not acts of despair, but of reverence. The thread connecting them all is not isolation, but integrity. When knowledge deepens, language begins to fail. The greatest insights, the kind that transform a life, cannot be translated into the grammar of conversation. They must be embodied, not explained. That's why the world's most profound teachings often come not from speeches, but from examples, lives lived so clearly that they communicate without sound. But in today's culture, silence has been rebranded as weakness. We are told to use our voice, to speak our truth, as if silence were a betrayal of authenticity. Yet this modern obsession with constant expression has distorted the original meaning of communication. The ancients knew that silence was not emptiness. It was comprehension. It was the moment when the mind finally stopped trying to conquer reality and began to coexist with it. Once, to be silent was to be wise. Now, to be silent is to be invisible. The tragedy of modern life is that we've confused visibility with value. We equate attention with importance, forgetting that some of the most transformative acts in human history happened in solitude. The true thinkers, the real visionaries, have always withdrawn not because they hated the world, but because they understood it too well. They realized that no amount of talking could awaken a mind not yet ready to listen. And so, they turned their gaze inward, not to escape the noise, but to transcend it. Their silence wasn't the absence of sound. It was the presence of truth. And maybe that's why their words, few as they were, continue to echo centuries later, because they were born not from noise, but from stillness, not from the need to be heard, but from the need to be true. Modern noise, when the unhealed rule, the conversation. We live in an era where the loudest voices dominate the silence, an age defined not by wisdom, but by volume. Everywhere, people are speaking, commenting, debating, performing. Everyone has an opinion, and everyone must share it instantly. Yet beneath this constant communication lies something tragic. Most of it isn't born from understanding, but from unrest. The unhealed now rule the conversation, and the modern world rewards them for it. This is not an insult, it's an observation. Because the truth is, our society thrives on keeping people unhealed. The louder we are, the easier we are to manipulate. The more reactive we become, the less we reflect. Modern culture has turned unresolved pain into a resource, something to be mined, monetized, and molded. Every scroll, every post, every argument feeds on our insecurities. Outrage keeps us engaged. Validation keeps us addicted. And together, these twin forces build an invisible system, one that converts human pain into profit. Think about how attention has become the new currency. Every platform is designed to amplify emotional extremes. Anger spreads faster than reason. Outrage generates clicks. Fear drives consumption. We are no longer individuals speaking from reflection. We are reactors, shouting from reflex. The tragedy is that behind nearly every loud proclamation lies an unhealed wound. The activist who screams online may be fighting not just injustice, but their own history of invisibility. The influencer who overshares their life may be trying to drown out their loneliness. The commentator who attacks others' beliefs might simply be defending their own fragile sense of certainty. Our world has mistaken noise for truth, forgetting that chaos often sounds passionate while wisdom whispers. This addiction to noise is not random, it's systemic. Institutions, corporations, and media industries have learned to weaponize our unhealed psychology. When people are divided, anxious, and emotionally volatile, they consume more, argue more, and question less. The calm, silent, self-possessed individual is dangerous to the system precisely because they cannot be baited. They don't buy impulsively. They don't react predictably. They don't need the validation the system sells. So the culture teaches us to equate silence with weakness and noise with relevance. To be quiet is to be irrelevant. To be still is to be forgotten. To pause is to lose your place in the algorithm. This is how the unhealed rule, not through conscious malice, but through participation in a machinery that exploits their pain. They keep the cycle alive, feeding it with every reactive post, every impulsive opinion, every performative confession. The world watches, applauds, and scrolls on, addicted to the next display of emotional volatility. But what does healing look like in this chaos? It looks like withdrawal, not of apathy, but of discernment. The healed stop adding to the noise because they see it for what it is, a distraction from truth. They begin to value quiet observation over reaction, understanding over argument, presence over performance. This silence threatens the system. The moment people stop reacting, they start thinking. The moment they start thinking, they become free. And freedom, real freedom, is the one thing noise was always meant to drown out. Look around at the digital landscape, and you'll see it clearly. People mistaking constant communication for connection, outrage for purpose, exposure for authenticity. We've built a world that confuses expression with existence. And yet, despite all this talking, humanity feels lonelier than ever. Because true connection doesn't happen through volume. It happens through resonance, and resonance requires silence. It requires listening, reflection, and the courage to stop performing. It requires a healed mind that no longer fears the emptiness of quiet moments. In this sense, the healed become invisible, not because they've disappeared, but because they refuse to compete for attention. Their silence becomes their rebellion. Their restraint becomes their power. The world mistakes their quiet for absence, not realizing that in their silence lies the only kind of voice that can't be manipulated. A voice that doesn't need to speak to be understood. And that's what terrifies the noise the most, because silence, in its purest form, cannot be controlled. It cannot be sold, politicized, or turned into content. It simply exists, and in doing so, exposes how hollow the noise has become. The more wounded we are, the louder we become. The more healed we are, the quieter we grow. And in that quiet, the world's illusions begin to crumble, one unspoken truth at a time. The return to stillness, the strength of saying nothing. At the end of every journey toward understanding, there comes a return, not to where we began, but to a deeper, quieter version of it. The noise fades, the questions slow, and what remains is something the world rarely celebrates anymore: stillness. Healing is often misunderstood as a process of addition, of learning, growing, becoming more. But the truth is far simpler and far more difficult. Healing is a process of subtraction. It's what happens when everything false begins to fall away. Every defense, every identity built on pain, every word once used to fill the silence. What's left isn't a new self, but the original one, untouched, unspoken, whole. In that stillness, something extraordinary happens. You stop needing to be heard. You stop needing to prove that you've changed or that you've survived. You stop needing to explain your peace to those still addicted to chaos. The healed person learns that silence is not an absence of engagement. It's the highest form of it. Because silence listens where speech interrupts. It observes where noise demands. There's a power in this kind of silence that cannot be imitated. It isn't passive. It isn't fragile. It's the strength that comes from no longer being at war with yourself. When the need to defend dissolves, so does the need to speak. The mind no longer seeks witnesses. It has nothing left to win. Modern life teaches us to equate power with presence, to believe that visibility defines value. But the healed discover a different kind of presence, one that doesn't need an audience. It's found in the quiet confidence of someone who no longer performs. The more healed you become, the less interested you are in proving anything to anyone. You don't retreat out of disdain. You simply no longer need to participate in every echo that demands a reply. This return to stillness isn't isolation. It's sovereignty. It's the moment you realize that peace doesn't need to announce itself. It radiates. The healed person walks through the same world as everyone else, but differently. Grounded, deliberate, quiet. Their silence is not coldness. It's composure. It's the calm that comes when you stop confusing reaction with relevance. And when they do speak, it's with precision. Their words no longer come from impulse or insecurity, but from clarity. Silence refines speech. It filters noise into meaning. So when the healed finally choose to speak, their words carry the weight of stillness behind them. Each one deliberate, necessary, alive. This is the paradox of healing. It doesn't make you louder. It makes you truer. You don't stop talking because you have nothing to say. You stop talking because you finally understand which words are worth saying. Perhaps that's the essence of peace. Not the absence of sound, but the absence of unnecessary sound. The realization that truth doesn't need to defend itself. It stands, quiet and unmoving, like a mountain in the wind. Maybe healing isn't about learning how to express more. Maybe it's about learning when expression no longer serves you. Because when you've truly healed, you begin to see that the loudest thing about you doesn't come from your voice. It comes from your silence. Because in the end, the most profound statement any human being can make is to say nothing at all.